Do you miss home? How are you feeling these holidays? How's the winter treating you? When was the first time you felt homesick in China? Or when was the last time you felt homesick in China? In my case, the first time I felt homesick was during winter. I think it's really easy to feel homesick in winter, especially because every time you check your social media or group chats, you see those family photos and where they're celebrating and having delicious homemade food. And even though seeing those pictures brings you joy and make you smile, sometimes they're subtle reminders that you're not home. Then you have these mixed feelings about your experience in China because on the one hand, you're happy to see your family celebrating and maybe even excited about your life in China, but on the other hand, maybe you feel unhappy about not being able to join your family gatherings, and maybe you don't even regard your life in China as exciting. But the reality is that you're in China now, and maybe your professional or academic responsibilities or economic constraints prevent you from flying back home. So now what? Life is here and now, but what can you do about feeling homesick? Keep listening if you want to know how feeling homesick could actually be a gateway to connect with people in ways you never imagined. Welcome to China University. This is Chimsy, your student advisor. In this podcast, I will not only talk about the many professional, academic, and personal growth opportunities this country has to offer, but also I'll mention some of the major obstacles foreign students encounter while living in China. I'll share my experience, thoughts, and opinions along with some realistic advice and genuine encouragement. Remember that you can now listen to full episodes not only on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and where you can find me as China University Student Advisor. But you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram as China University Podcast and Twitter as China Uni Podcast. If you have any feedback, comments, or topic ideas, please feel free to contact me on your favorite social media platform or send an email to chinapodcast@outlook.com. Anyway, welcome to today's episode, Feeling Homesick in China. If you're listening to this episode, chances are that you're currently living or have lived in China and have experienced homesickness at some point. First of all, it's important to understand that homesickness is a normal and natural feeling. It's a form of longing for the familiar and the comfortable, and it often arises when we're faced with new and unfamiliar situations. This can be especially true when living in a foreign country where everything from the language and culture to the food and daily routines may be different from what we're used to. If you're feeling homesick in China, it's important to remember that it's okay to feel this way. It's a natural response to being away from home. And it doesn't mean that you made a mistake by coming to China or that you don't belong here. It's just a temporary feeling that will pass with time. So, a few years back, I met this really outgoing and extroverted guy in college. He was really friendly and treated all his friends as family, and he would fly back home every winter and summer, but as opposed to most people who would document every single part of their trip back home by posting pictures of their passports containing their flight tickets, pictures of the plane seen from the gate or ones in the air, pictures of the plane's wings with the clouds in the background, this friend would not make a single post about his trip back home, and even though we were close enough, he would not mention a single thing about his trip back home to me or to anyone. I never gave it much thought until one day I ran into him on my way out and helped him carry his luggage all the way to the main gate. It was a long and quiet walk to the gate, so of course, my refusal to embrace awkward silences pushed me into starting a small talk with him. And given the fact that we were one step away from freezing to death while waiting for the taxi, and given the fact that he came from a tropical country, I decided to say, "Aren't you excited that you can escape this awful winter and enjoy the warm temperatures back home?" And he just smiled and said that even though the weather was nice in his country, he wasn't excited about going back home. He said he would mostly go back home to work part-time jobs and save enough money so he wouldn't have to rely on the scholarship's money so much once he would get back to China. He told me he was working at a family-owned restaurant and hotel, which made me think that his parents simply wanted their son to earn his own money and learn the meaning and value of hard work, which doesn't seem to be a bad idea in my opinion. But my friend wasn't excited at all, as far as I could tell. On my way back home, I couldn't help it but to think about my own family and friends back home. For 1 minute, I thought about going back home during summer and winter vacations so I could kill two birds with one stone. I would visit my family and get some part time jobs. But man, this friend of mine lived in tropical Asia. I bet that if he ever forgets to bring his wallet to China, he could literally fly back home, retrieve his wallet, and return to China all in less than 6 hours. But me, I come from tropical Latin America. And if the shortest trip is 18 hours long and the longest trip is 36 hours long, it means that it would take me an average of 27 hours. Man, 27 hours? 27 hours, it means you can watch the new Avatar movie 9 times in a row. I dare you. I dare you to watch the new Avatar movie 9 times in a row. Watch 27 hours of endless fights. But yeah, I hope you can appreciate the beauty in that tangent just now. So, where was I? Yeah, finding a part-time job back home. Yeah, I don't know how things work in your country, but in my country, part-time jobs are very rare. And since it's relatively expensive for companies, particularly small companies, to pay for the social security of a single employee, it goes without saying that for most companies, ensuring a part-timer is not worth it, especially if they only plan to work for a month or two. So later on that same winter, I experienced many feelings that I talked about in the first episode of this podcast titled Feeling Lonely in China. I had to come to terms with feeling lonely, especially because most people would fly back home or go traveling, and since the weather wasn't very favorable at the time, the rest of the students who decided to stay in campus would rarely come out of their rooms. So it was really hard to find opportunities to socialize for more than a few seconds whenever you run into someone on the way to the canteen or on your way back to the dorms. But with the very few people that I was able to connect during that time, I realized that many of them were feeling homesick just like I was. And the way I found out was by simply asking. I think no one ever asked that question. No one ever asks whether you're feeling homesick or lonely. And I think that's because it's not our first instinct to be vulnerable in front of others. But I can assure you that most people never get the chance to speak about these type of feelings. And some people will pour their hearts out the moment you bring up topics like feeling homesick or lonely. This is how I found out that the degree in which I miss home and my family is not so different than the degree others miss their homes and loved ones. A couple of months later, I was walking through the empty streets of my university campus and I caught sight of a familiar face up ahead in the distance. And it was my friend, who had just returned from his winter break back home. And I couldn't believe my eyes. I had missed him so much. I ran up to him and gave him a huge hug, and he smiled and hugged me back. I was so glad to see him. And the first thing I remember asking was, "How's the trip?" To my surprise, my friend didn't seem as excited at all. He said that his trip back home was just, quote unquote, okay. But still, he didn't look very happy. I was so confused because most people I knew who went back home for winter break couldn't wait to leave China and see their families and friends back home. And I wish I had the chance to go back home and see my family the first year, so I had to ask, "But weren't you happy to see your family and friends back home?" My friend hesitated for like, what, 10 seconds before confessing to me that he doesn't really have a family. He he was an orphan. The family he worked for during his breaks was not his biological family. They had taken him from an orphanage as a teenager and given him a job and a place to stay. And even though he felt grateful to a certain extent, he often felt like he didn't belong there. especially because the family treated him like an employee and not like a family member. He said that somehow he saw China and his classmates and friends as his real home and family. And I don't know how to explain it, but I was stunned. I felt like I had a baseball stuck in my throat. I had no idea. Seriously, I had no idea my friend had been through something so difficult. I apologized and felt a deep sense of sadness and compassion for him. But he said it was okay and that after so many years, he had now learned to make his own way in the world. But still, I was so shocked and saddened by this revelation. And I could see the pain and sadness in my friend's eyes. I could not imagine how hard it must have been to grow up without a loving family or to feel like an outsider in the only home he had ever known. But as we talked more, I could see the determination and resilience in my friend's eyes as well. He told me about his dreams for the future and how he was determined to make a better life for himself. He hoped to one day form a new family and build a home and a life that he could be proud of. To be honest, in that moment, part of me wished that I had never asked him about his family. But at the same time, I'm happy I did because otherwise I think I would have never seen my own feelings of homesickness and loneliness in a different way. And this guy put things into perspective so much. He had no choice but to make the most of the friendships and other relationships that he had in China. And this was essentially what made him feel home. This leads me to the part of this podcast in where I give you my piece of realistic advice. So, how can you deal with homesickness while living in China? Here are a few reminders and tips. First off, stay connected with home. Use technology to stay in touch with friends and family back home. Set up regular video calls and send regular messages to stay connected and alleviate those feelings of loneliness and isolation. Second, find ways to connect with your new community in China. Seek out social groups or activities that align with your interests, such as joining a sport team or a language exchange group. This can help you feel more connected to your new home and create a greater sense of belonging. Third, practice self-care. Homesickness can take a toll on your mental and emotional well-being. Make sure to prioritize self-care and take care of your physical and emotional health. This might include things like getting enough sleep, eating well, and taking breaks to relax and recharge. Fourth, and most importantly, create a familiar routine. Establishing a daily routine can help you feel more grounded and connected to your new surroundings. This might include things like cooking your favorite meals, setting aside time for your favorite hobbies, or finding ways to incorporate familiar events into your daily life, like preparing your country's traditional dishes, listening or dancing to songs that are trendy back home, watching TV shows from your country. And if you can do all this with your friends, that's even better. My genuine encouragement for you today is remember, homesickness is a natural and temporary feeling that will pass with time. Don't be afraid to reach out for support if you're feeling overwhelmed or are struggling to cope. There are always people available to help you through challenging times. And probably there are also people who can relate to how you feel. So remember that you're not alone. I always like to finish every episode with a famous quote, and today's quote is a famous saying by an unknown author, and it says, "Home is where the heart is." Let me repeat that. Home is where the heart is. And if you're in China right now, it means that your heart is also in China. So you might as well regard China and your friends as your home and your family, even if it's temporary. This might not make you feel less homesick, but it will certainly create many opportunities for you to connect with people in such ways that will allow you to develop a greater sense of belonging. All right, that's it for today. Next week. Yes, next week, because I will take a long break from the podcast. I will talk about identity crisis in China. Because when you're surrounded by so many different people with so many different cultural backgrounds, it's easy to get confused in the process of fitting in and you might become someone that you're not. Let's talk about it next time. But before I let you go, remember that you can now listen to full episodes not only on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcast, and where you can find me as China University Student Advisor. But you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram as China University Podcast, and also on Twitter as China Uni Podcast. If you have any feedback, comments, or topic ideas, please feel free to contact me on your favorite social media platform or send an email to chinapodcast@outlook.com. You have just listened to China University Podcast. This was Chimsy, your student advisor. I'll see you next time.